I do want to just start by thanking everyone for being here these last few weeks. It's been a real privilege to spend time with you all. And, as an outsider, I've gotten a neat glimpse of your church and how God's moving, and I'm just really excited about hanging out with other believers that are convicted and just want to serve the Lord. So that's really special. And I think your pastor, you mentioned about the youth pastor, and from everything, I don't think Daryl's here, right?
Yeah.
So,
right.
Say this is, oh, he is here, come on. I was just going to say that I do think that your new pastor is having a positive impact on the church, and I do thank you, Daryl, for letting me come and speak. It's a real privilege, and I don't take it lightly. Pastors make the difference.
Yes.
They sure do.
And that's really the topic for tonight, is to talk about pastors and what they did with respect to the war, the fight for independence, framing the argument for independence. But we're going to see that it was really the pastors that actually made the difference. So let's jump in first with a little bit of review. First, these are the things that I'm really hoping that you walk away and remember from this series. Number one, true liberty and freedom comes from God. It comes from no one else but God. Our most important liberty that we have is our freedom of conscience to choose to follow or reject God. It's the most important freedom or liberty that everyone that's ever lived has. And that's the most important freedom that we need to protect. Amen. Government's role is to protect that individual freedom and enable everyone to go on their own personal faith journey. And we're all on our own journey, right? If we took everyone in here and mapped it out from, confessing Christ to where you are and understanding your own gifts, understanding the Bible, we'd all be along that spectrum. Somewhere. Probably no two at the same spot. But even before one comes to know Christ, there's that seeking period where people are asking questions, ideally. Some are wrestling with God, some are arguing with God. But ultimately, we want to allow those searchers, the searching folks, to go on their own personal faith journey, unencumbered by anybody. And that includes the church or the state. Believers since the time of Noah have a stewardship responsibility to pass on these biblical principles to future generations. Why do I say since the time of Noah? Because it's after Noah and the flood that God gave us the institution of government. Recall that he wiped out mankind because he looked around and he saw a couple things. One, that the inclination of the heart of every man was only evil all the time. And secondly, that the world was filled with violence. So we hit the redo button, if you will. But the question is, what would he do to give us a reason to believe that anything would be different? And the answer was, he gave us government. Why? To keep evil in check. Why? So that we could all go on our own personal faith journey and figure out who we were going to follow. The greatest enemy of our liberty is Satan. His objective is, frankly, to just take as many souls away from God as he can, and he'll do anything he can in order to pull that off. And we spent quite a lot of time last week looking at how he operates. He is the father of lies. He will deceit. He will do anything he can to thwart God's redemptive plan for mankind. That's the enemy here. And we talked about that because, number one, we don't often talk about Satan. I don't know why, but sermon topics on Satan just aren't popular. And as a result, we often don't spend time learning about angels, learning about really how Satan was once God's greatest angel, and then how he fell, and then what's happened since then. This is really the context of what's going on in Operation Planet Earth. Yeah.
Would it be all right to replace the word Satan for let's say morality? The word morality?
I think
because you can't have morality
in
without
a figurative
God.
sense. I think that's acceptable.
Yeah.
I don't want to lose sight, though, of who our direct enemy is. It's not my fellow American. And this is one of the reasons that I wanted to bring this up. Because sometimes I'll just confess, I get so frustrated sometimes with some of my fellow Americans. And I just have to step back and remember that if it weren't for the grace of God, I could be as stubborn and ignorant and in the dark as some of those folks are. It's a humbling reality, and it's one that I want to make sure folks don't lose sight of. The enemy is not our fellow Americans. it's Satan. And he's having his way. And so what we need to do is know our enemy so that we can combat him. So that's why we spend time on it. So tonight I want to talk about two questions. Number one, what did the pastors do? What was the role of the pastors and the church in America's bid for independence? A lot of folks think that the pastors had nothing to do with it. And that's just complete nonsense. And so we're just going to take a quick look at that. And then we'll wrap with a little bit of perspective on how should or might the church engage in the public arena today. What would be the model? Because in a lot of cases, the church is completely disengaged. And as we think about how we're losing our culture, there's just no getting around the fact that if the church disengages in the culture, we know which way it'll go. So we'll take a look at that. So first, let's just look at a few perspectives here. John Adams was once asked, who was the most instrumental person in the Revolution? He was asked this later in life. I think it was like 1810-ish or so. And recall, this would be a period when a lot of the founders had died off. And so historians were starting to spend time with the living founders and trying to get a better sense of, what were they thinking? And, John Adams, who was the most important person in the Revolution? They fully expected him to say, George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or Benjamin Franklin. These are all people he worked really closely with. Some people expected him to say himself. John Adams was a little bit, he was sometimes high on himself. But who did he rattle off? Without hesitating, he rattled off 4 pastors. And these are the names: Samuel Cooper, Charles Chauncey, Jonathan Mayhew, George Whitefield. I only recognized one of those names. The last one, George Whitefield, who was one of the great evangelists of the age. He was part of the First Great Awakening, which, recall, we said prepared the heart of America for independence. He didn't list anyone who was a politician or was involved in drafting or ratifying the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. He listed pastors. Why? Because he understood that it was the pastors who were shaping the heart and the mind of America to prepare them for independence. Pastors were very active. We know this because we have many of their sermons in record. We don't have, in fact, we have a small percentage of their messages. These guys, especially circuit riders, they gave thousands and thousands of sermons. But the really good ones were written down and published. Why? Because they were really good. And we have a few of those. This is an example of one from Jonathan Mayhew, a 1750 election sermon. It is the duty of Christian magistrates to inform themselves what it is which their religion teaches concerning the nature and design of their office. And it is equally the duty of all Christian people to inform themselves what it is which their religion teaches concerning that subjection which they owe to their higher powers. Now, this is just one snippet of an election sermon, but he captures really the idea here. Folks that are governing should know their role in governing. They should know their boundaries. They should understand what it is God would have them to do. And those that are being governed should understand the same thing. And that whole sermon was about an election. And in fact, sermons were quite normal and popular for over 300 years in America. It was only until the mid-1950s when election sermons became taboo because of the Johnson Amendment that was passed that said that nonprofit organizations couldn't support a candidate. So a lot of churches started to tune out. And rather than talk about the principles by which the congregation should consider to vote for candidate A or B, they really just stopped having election sermons altogether. I can only remember hearing one sermon in my lifetime talking about the responsibility of every Christian to vote. Only one. I'm 50. It wasn't that way before. Pastors were routinely talking about the biblical principles, not only behind government, but behind self-government. Because one of the most important principles that they believed and were teaching was that the best way to have a free and prosperous society was for folks to self-govern. In other words, self-regulate. And so this fits perfectly with Galatians 5:22 and 23, the fruit of the Spirit passage. Remember that? Fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things, there is no law. So that's one of the best passages that talks about the need for self-government, self-regulation. And without that, you're really in trouble, because no government can legislate the behavior of everyone in a society if none of them are self-regulating themselves. So this idea of self-government, self-regulation, is really a very important concept, and of course they were talking about it all the time from the pulpit. So what did they understand? They understood the need for self-government. Just thought that. They understood civil government as an institution ordained by God. And they understood the nation of Israel, the history of the nation of Israel, in part, as an example of a nation that struggled to govern themselves by those principles. Think about that for a second, especially you Old Testament buffs. Old Testament's really important. You know, a lot of times we tend to focus on just the New Testament, but I like the old phrase that said the New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. The Old Testament is the New Testament concealed, and the New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. And so one of the wonderful dimensions of the Old Testament that we rarely talk about is how the nation of Israel struggled to follow God's principles for government, which were ordained right after the flood, and then clarified in the book of Deuteronomy, Leviticus, all over the place. There's information about how governments ought to act. We read some of those passages. They understood that. Colonial pastors also understood that when government violated their individual religious and civil liberties, it was tyranny. They did not equivocate on this one bit. And just to highlight a few ways that they thought about tyranny, this is just a summary. In fact, I got this from, I think I got it from Peter Marshall's book, if I remember correctly. There were 4 things that he talked about. According to the scripture, tyranny was when a ruler breaks the commandment of 2 Samuel 23:3, which says, "He that ruleth over man must be just, ruling in the fear of God." Colonial pastors looked at that and said, if the ruler was not fearing God, it was tyranny. The Puritan view of tyranny was that when a ruler knowingly and deliberately contravenes the will of God, thus making it impossible for his subjects to follow that divine will, that became tyranny. According to the Magna Carta, now I'm getting all historical on you, the Magna Carta was, I think it was 1215, somewhere in there, the 13th century. This is when the English noblemen forced the king at the time, I forget who it was, Charles I, maybe, one of those guys. They forced him to respect the rights of Englishmen. That's what the Magna Carta was all about. So that was almost like their 10 Commandments. And they looked at that and said, you know what? If the Magna Carta, which establishes English common law, when a ruler ceases to act under that law and denies his subjects their rights that are guaranteed, it's tyranny. And then lastly, by parliamentary interpretation, it is when an Englishman have measures imposed upon them, such as taxation without their consent, or even in any representation at all. Notice this is the last one that's listed. What we're told today is that the Revolutionary War was primarily about taxation without representation. That's what we're told. That was actually complaint number 17 in the Declaration of Independence, which had 27 complaints. That was not high on the list. That's not really why the colonials rebelled. Taxes are too high, let's rebel. That really wasn't the issue. It was one of many issues. So this is how the pastors defined tyranny, and this is how they talked about it from the pulpit. Lastly, their understanding was that since governments were prone to infringe on individual liberty, they must be limited. Even in the 1600s and 1700s, there was enough history, certainly recent history even, that told them that they had to constantly be concerned about their government having too much power. We read a couple weeks ago the passage in Samuel where, remember, Israel was asking for a king, and Samuel went to the Lord and he said, don't worry, it's not you they're rejecting me, but tell them this. Remember the passage? It was a long passage, and basically Samuel goes to the people of Israel and says, listen, this is what God says. The king's going to take away your sons, he's going to take away your daughters, he's going to take away all your stuff. You know, he just lays it out. And the colonial pastors believed that, and they saw thousands of years of history confirming that that's the tendency. So what should we do with government? Because we need it. What's the answer? It should be limited. That was their view. I mentioned they gave annual messages dealing with elections, liberty, God's judgment of nations. If they disobey God's moral law, they gave messages on this routinely for 350 years. And then things changed, and we talked about that last week. I want to talk about a couple of pastors in particular, and these are just two that I love because they represent men of God who had conviction with their ministry, but also had conviction about their country, but not at the same time. And this was part of what makes this story interesting. So John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg gave a famous sermon on January the 21st, 1776. A little bit about him. He was ordained both as a Lutheran and an Anglican minister. He had to be an Anglican minister in order to be a minister in Virginia, because Virginia was an Anglican church state. Remember I talked about how states had their own churches. And Virginia was Anglican, so if you wanted to be a pastor in Virginia, you had to be ordained as an Anglican minister, which he did. He pastored 2 churches in a little rural town of Woodstock, Virginia. He was also a member of the Virginia legislature. In the winter of 1775, prior to the Declaration, the British marched into Williamsburg and started confiscating property of folks in their homes. So Muhlenberg jumps on his horse, rides back to Woodstock, and there on Sunday he preaches this famous sermon from Ecclesiastes 3. That's the passage where it says, to everything there is a time, there is a purpose, there is a season, there's a season for growing, season for planting. He gets to the 8th verse, which is, there's a time of war and a time of peace. And he declared, this is a time of war. He removed his clerical robes to reveal the army of a continental colonel's uniform. And as he walked down the aisle, he continued to preach, explaining why it was necessary for the colonials to fight. He got to the back. He concluded by saying, we came here to practice our liberties, and if we don't get involved, we're going to lose them. Now, who's going with me to defend them? Within a half hour, 162 had signed up, and the next day he would lead 300 men in what would become the 8th Virginia Regiment. He would become a major general in the Revolutionary War, be one of Washington's top generals, as well as serve in the 1st, the 3rd, and the 5th Congress of the United States after the Constitution was ratified. So it's a great story. He's got a statue in Capitol Hall, in the Statue Hall. So if you ever go to the Capitol building, look for it. And I was amazed at how much he looks like George Washington. I had to do a double take and make sure I got the right picture. So he has a brother named Augusta Muhlenberg, Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg. And he was a pastor in New York. Now, what I like about Frederick is he really exemplifies the modern day conundrum our pastors have on the question of, do I get involved or not? So while he saw his brother Peter with this dramatic fanfare, which he thought was totally inappropriate, he told his brother that, and there's actually a letter, a private letter from Peter to Frederick. I was reading part of it. It's an amazing letter. He's just very candid with his brother, but his brother still refused. He just didn't feel it was right. Until the British came into New York and set his church on fire. And he stood outside watching his church burn to the ground. And he realized that maybe he should get involved. And he did. He would go on to become the first U.S. Speaker of the House. He is one of 2 signatures on the Bill of Rights. So So when the Constitution was ratified, Washington was elected, Adams was the vice president, Frederick Muhlenberg, was the Speaker of the House. And when they passed the first 10 amendments, which we call the Bill of Rights, John Adams and Frederick Muhlenberg signed it. Were these pastors involved or not?
Yes.
Had they checked their faith at the door?
No.
Was their faith a deterrent for getting involved?
No.
Well, for one it was, until the realities of losing your liberty confronted him face to face. Now, the problem is, do we need to get to that point to understand
No.
that freedom and liberty, our liberty of conscience, our freedom to choose to follow God or not, even to protect it for those who will not choose to follow Him? That is so important, and God gave us the institution of government to protect that freedom. Do we really need to wait until it comes down to my church is on fire before getting involved? Colonial pastors didn't feel that way. But I appreciate the conundrum that Frederick went through. First, it's like, nah, I don't know, I don't think we should get involved. But then he did, and he went on to have a great career, and he was a very instrumental person at the beginning of our nation. Here's the verdict. Independence would not have been won without the pastors. They framed the argument. They prepared the heart of America to do something very, very difficult, take on the globalist, the biggest global world power to fight for independence. That's what they did. It was the pastors who helped educate and encourage and, in some cases, lead to bring about the American miracle. It would not have happened without them. Here's just a few statements. These are comments from other leaders at the time, and I'm showing these to help with what were they thinking. Understanding that what drives what they were thinking was based on what they heard in where? Church. So here's John Adams. This is early in his career, 1765. I always consider the settlement of America with reverence and wonder as the opening of a grand scene and design in providence, that means God ordained, for the illumination of the ignorant and the emancipation of the slavish part of mankind over all earth. It's somewhat of a prophetic statement when you think about when he wrote this. America was still a bush country, not even third rate, really. And he saw it through the prism of the Bible. Now, I'm not giving him the credit. I'm giving the pastors the credit that educated him. Here's another one, Thomas Jefferson, who many claim was a deist. He was not a deist, by the way. Why do I say that? Because I can show you quotes that would where he directly looks to God. And this is one of them. This is from his notes on the state of Virginia. Can the liberties of a nation be secure when we have removed a conviction that these liberties are a gift of God? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that His justice cannot sleep forever. Anyone identify with this statement in here?
No. Amen.
This, by the way, is inscribed in the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. And there are literally dozens and dozens of inscriptions like this in Washington that reflect the faith of the men and women who fought to secure our freedom. Here's another one. This is what jumps out at me on these is people's view of the Bible. What did they view of the Bible? What had the pastors taught them about their view of the Bible, or what their view should be? Patrick Henry. The Bible is a book worth more than all the other books that were ever printed. Noah Webster. The Bible is the chief moral cause of all that is good and the best corrector of all that is evil in human society. The best book for regulating the temporal, that is secular, concerns of men. Benjamin Rush. The Bible should be read in our schools and in preference to all other books. From its containing the greatest portion of that kind of knowledge which is calculated to produce private and public happiness. And then this last one that really ties our series together. Daniel Webster. To the free and universal reading of the Bible, men are much indebted for right views of civil liberty. The Bible is the book which teaches man his own individual responsibility, his own dignity, his own equality with his fellow man. These are great statements, but what I wanted you to see is all these folks, who hopefully you recognize some of these names, they all thought that the Bible was very important. So this is my last slide before I turn it over to Dave. And what I wanted to do was talk about, so what might a roadmap for church engagement be today? We've obviously been making the case for a very biblical worldview behind the founding of America. We have a government that's based on Judeo-Christian principles. And so how might that inform how the church should engage today? So here's some thoughts. Thought one, you're probably already halfway through the page. First off, as the stewards of God's moral law, the church must continue to hold up God's truth and declare right from wrong. We must declare our positions on key biblical institutions. Marriage. The first institution God gave to man was marriage in the garden. Marriage and family. That's not for us to redefine. I know there's a lot of talk going on right now about redefining marriage. Now, we could talk about the problems with homosexual marriage, and we should talk about those. But since, this is family, we just have to always remember that God ordained marriage. And marriage, as defined in our laws, is part of the Judeo-Christian blueprint that we have in America. Redefining marriage would almost be like going into another faith, pick anyone you want, and redefining part of their faith. Just telling them that, no, you can no longer believe this. I'll pick one that's a little controversial. In the Muslim faith, they believe in Sharia law. Well, let's not even get into Sharia law. But I don't have any right to go to them and say, you must redefine this aspect of your faith. It's your faith. It's not my faith. It's your faith. But you must redefine it. Asking to redefine marriage, which is a Judeo-Christian institution, the first institution, is almost that offensive. Redefining government, redefining any of these things. These are God's institutions, not ours. Then, the second bullet, when do we take a stand? I think that's really the question. And the point that I've been trying to make is there's a difference between principle and policy. We can have a lot of heated discussion about policy. Healthcare. I think all Christians would love to see everyone have healthcare. The question is how. So healthcare in itself isn't an evil thing. It's certainly biblical to help our fellow man. It's when laws violate what? Our liberty of conscience. That's when you throw the flag. And our brothers and sisters in the Catholic Church are fighting a battle, frankly, that I feel like the rest of the evangelical community should be coming along and helping them with. And that's the concern they have with being told they have to offer a plan that includes contraception and abortion-inducing drugs, which obviously we have a problem with as well. So that if that violates your conscience, which it should for most evangelical Christians, we should take a stand. We've got to take a stand. That's not what our declaration stands for. Remember, we went through that a couple of weeks ago. Life, liberty of conscience, and the pursuit of happiness. That's the doctrinal statement that defined our nation. So it's a little tricky, but we've got to look at the liberty behind the laws that are being passed. And if our liberty of conscience is being violated, then I would suggest that the church needs to speak out. Point 3. I've been involved in starting several churches. I've been in church leadership. And I can tell you the goal of every church board is to get as many people involved as possible. We always want to try and get more people involved. But I can tell you that I did not appreciate how some are called to be engaged in the public arena. They are just wired for it. They're wired to debate. They're articulate. They won't back down. These aren't necessarily the people you want as others. You did. See, the older gentleman, you've probably seen this quite a bit. These are the people that you want to go do battle. And we need to encourage them. We need to train them. We need to give them the arguments. We need to train them the way the pastors trained the founding fathers. And then we need to encourage them. And we need to pray for them. We may need even support them, maybe privately. But the point is, God gives the church everything we need to maintain a stable and productive society. And I can tell, looking back on my own experience, that there were people in congregations I was involved with that, in hindsight, it's like I had a duh moment. We should have been encouraging some of these folks to get engaged. They're the ones that need to do that. So this is just something that the church needs to think about. And then last, we need to train, encourage, and support the congregation to get involved with faith-based ministries. I think this is the best way for the church to train the congregation and then send them off. Get involved in things like crisis pregnancy. There's so many good organizations. I don't see Jerry here. Jerry Pruitt.
They're out of town.
They're out of town. But you know, Jerry is your guy who has lots of connections. You're going to talk more about this, I think, in a moment. But there are many faith-based organizations that are excellent and to be involved with. And as Christians, we need to support those and get involved where we feel led. And that's all I was going to say, so let me turn it right over to
Do you want to answer any questions?
Well, I'm afraid you might not get time. So
okay. All right. I'll hold it. So, let's see. I got to figure out which way goes. That way. Okay. What I want to do tonight, for the few minutes we have, I've got 3 objectives that I've said in the past. One is, okay, what's next for us, okay, as a Liberty series? So that's one question I want to be able to address a little bit. And then summarize what Mark has said over the last 5 weeks in one quick slide. Say what's next, what do we think, what Mark and I are thinking about, and I'll share a little bit of information about that. And then the next piece is really, you know, what's our responsibility? Okay, now that you've heard it, for those that have been here for all 5 weeks, what is our responsibility as individuals? I want to just, you know, tickle your thoughts a little bit about that. Yeah, Ronnie.
I at the end, I heard him say about we shouldn't be redefining government, but if we don't, I mean, I find that false, because if we don't use our vote to vote for godly people, then we of course won't define government. But if we put new people in, we will
Ronnie,
will define.
You're right. What we're saying is that we should not redefine God's government, not our government.
Well,
we need to vote.
I'm sorry, I'm a godly man. My vote is for God.
No. I understand.
You understand?
I understand.
Okay.
Okay. And then I want to talk a little bit. This was sort of a preview of Wednesday night gatherings that we'd like to think about what's going on, you know, in the future, and so I've got a little bit of talk about that. So I want to cover all of those, and so I'm going to try to be as quick and as efficient as I can. Okay, I want to summarize this. But first of all, this whole series and what Mark's been talking about is not, and I want to be very strong with it. It's not a discussion, a battle between left and right. It's not the conservatives versus the liberals. It's not the progressives versus, you know, the conservatives. It's what we've been talking about is God's continual battle with Satan. And that's how we ought to be thinking about it. We shouldn't be thinking about it, as Mark said, about our fellow Christians and our fellow Americans. And we're not in battle with them. We should love them, and we should deal with them, and we should give them the information they need. But it's not our battle with our individuals. And as Mark summarized earlier, God gave us the institution of government to protect our freedoms and liberties and to keep evil in check. And without it, we know if you go before the flood and read the Bible before the flood, you see what life was like when you don't have government. And it's every individual's right. God gave us that right to pursue Him and to pursue living by His standards. And any time that we are challenged to give up pursuing that right is what Mark has been talking about, that we should never give up the right to be able to pursue God in whatever fashion our path and our journey takes us on. And that sort of covers the ideal evangelistic environment is for individuals to be able to have that right and pursue it. So that sort of summarizes the 4.5 weeks that we've been through and what Mark's covered in four points. You know, he put a lot more into it than I did, so I'm thankful that he did it, not me. So, and the last is, it's the stewardship responsibility of the church to hold up these truths. And I want to point out, as Mark was talking right at the end, he didn't mention that the church ought to be managing those things, and we shouldn't necessarily be the one financing it and having it as a ministry, but we ought to be the encouraging. We ought to be training and equipping, just as we do with discipleship in other areas of our ministry. Train them and equip them, encourage them to go out and work in this field. So we're not asking, as part of this, that the church take on and bear that responsibility. In some areas it may be right. Some churches may feel that, and if they feel that God is leading them to that is fine, well and good. Yeah, Carol?
How do you equip and encourage and support without throwing money at it? Good question.
By training.
How do you train?
You personally invest in it.
Yeah, you personally invest versus a church. That's a good way of looking at it. And versus the church saying, we're going to have this ministry and we are going to put funds against this ministry, that it's more training and equipping and personal investments that we do that. And in some cases it may be the church taking some stuff on.
Let me take this a step farther. Have the churches given up the right to talk in exchange for tax-free status? Should we maybe give that tax-free status up and be leaders in the country?
Well, I tell you,
I agree.
Let me. I'm gonna put that as aside in my pocket because I have a great answer for that, because I know exactly what that is, and my 10-second answer is they don't have to give up anything. Okay? They do not have to. The law is not written such that we would give up anything.
It's unconstitutional.
But I don't want to go into that right now, Carol. But I'll be glad to talk to you about it, and others if you want. Because that is one thing that I have read and researched.
How to get changed?
I can cover that later.
By the wrong people we voted.
Bonnie.
I know.
Francis, take care, Ronnie, will you?
I'm sorry.
Mark talked about pastors telling people how to vote. My understanding is they had to stop that. It's now against the law, is that right?
Again, I don't want to cover that. That's the same question asked a different way that Carol was asking.
Okay.
And so I don't want to cover that now because that would be a long, drawn-out question. That I'll be glad to talk it. I'm not holding back from talking it, but I don't want to take up our time right here.
He's only got 5 more minutes.
So what can we do as individuals? Okay, obviously, what's the Bible say about prayer? Praying for our leaders and praying for our country. We ought to be doing that. That ought to be foremost on our minds. And I know Ronnie and others are doing that. And we ought to be praying for our country and for our leaders. The other one that I would like to do, this is my piece to this, is that we have all grown up in different eras of time. We have teenagers, we have some older people in the room, and we've all grown up at different times of life. And our value systems, what we believe is right or wrong or good or bad, have been established by what impacted us when we were growing up, when we were ages of 2 to 10. And for most of us, if you were around and older than probably 6 years old in 1963, what was the big event in 1963, November of 63? You probably know where you were. when you heard that news? That's because it had a profound impact on your life and it changed your value system. Likewise, those people that were at the ages of 2 to 10 when the Vietnam War was going on and we were broadcasting and seeing all the deaths over there, it had an impact. And what was that impact? Well, we had the flower generation that came out. So we are a victim of our culture and how we were grown up. What I'm asking you to do, and not for you to raise your hand and that, is that as you've heard all of this, that you look at your values and you decide whether or not your values are aligned with God's values. If you can sit here, and I'm not asking for anyone, please, if you look at it and you go, well, I believe that thou shalt not kill, but I understand why we ought to have abortion, and you try to separate those two decisions, then I encourage you to pray and think real hard about what your values are as individuals. And I take that as an example, not as this sole one. We are a product of our culture, and for us to change our values, we have to pray and think real hard and evaluate whether our values are aligned with what God wants them to be.
I think it's murder, not kill. And that's a big difference.
Yeah, there is.
Huge
Right.
difference.
I understand, Ron.
God,
Ron, I understand.
yeah. In the Old Testament, there were many slaughtered in the name of God. With His blessing.
Yes.
Yes. And He said, kill them all.
Corporately as a church, been through this, encourage, support, don't be silent when God's laws are violated, and educate. Because if we don't educate, who will? Do we expect the secular world to be able to understand God's values and principles and to want the government and our freedoms to be protected? They won't. It's our responsibility to educate. What's going to happen here, and I won't go through this, Mark is going to be doing some speaking to other places. We are having a website that's going to come up, and we'll put all the videos that we've been doing, and all the PowerPoint presentations and all the handouts will be available on that website. And we are going to encourage and try to take the same message to other churches and other organizations. So we are not going to be silent. So any support from you all, as word of mouth to get other churches to know what's going on and what we can do, we would be glad for that help with that. So we'd like your feedback, and for those that I have email addresses, to have my email address, we would love to know what you liked and didn't like about this four plus weeks. And I won't go through it today because I want to get back to the end part, but we really do want your feedback. So if you have ideas and thoughts around how to change this, we would love to hear it, because all we want to do is improve the message. We want to improve it so we can reach more people. So I want to do that. And then the last on Wednesday night services, and let me see, here we go. In the back, you may have saw this farm. But what the board, what pastor has led us to start thinking about is, how can we change Wednesday night and make Wednesday night have a broader menu for more people than just what we've done in the past over the prayer and Bible scripture study that pastor has led. And so this was sort of a prototype of, is this something that you'd like? So we would really like your feedback on that. What would you like to see on Wednesday nights as additional study topics, as additional things such as discipleship training, church leadership training, maybe some in-depth biblical study around a topic, our accountability groups. So whatever you think it would be appealing to you to be involved with on a Wednesday night, we'd like that. And it doesn't mean that we're going to come back to you and say, oh, now that you've suggested it, you can lead it. That's not what we want. We want your feedback, and you may be the right person to lead it, but more than likely what we're going to try to do is look at that and find the right person to lead that, so that we can have a better menu of classes and activities on Wednesday night to be able to draw people back in here.
Will this also go out Sunday?
No, not yet.
Okay. Because I'm just thinking, otherwise you're just taking us.
Yeah, good idea.
And you're split up. And
Yeah.
we're not going to get anybody that's not
Yep.
here.
Good idea.
Yeah, it's something that's starting in the fall, so we'll probably wait till we get to the fall before we
I think some of us are missing the Wednesday night service. Why don't you do both? Why don't you go 6:30 to 7:15 with a service like we just had, and then 7:15 to 8 do these breakout sessions?
And we have childcare issues with that. I mean, we could consider it, but there's other issues besides just the people who are in here. We have babysitters and teens and children. We don't want them just wandering around doing nothing.
Yeah. No? No?
I'd like to contradict what he just said. Just about almost all almost all the kids here on Wednesday nights are back there till at least 8:15 or later anyway, because their parents are either in choir or orchestra, so it wouldn't really be an extra strain on Pastor James and those guys, because they're already doing that with all the kids anyway. They'll be in the gym until at least 8, often 8:15, sometimes as late as 8:30 or 8:40 every single week anyway. So I see little or no harm in moving to a longer Wednesday night thing, and I'd like to see that myself.
I'd like to contradict what he said. He's probably right, but we do still have children and babies and infants, and that's the volunteers who are giving up of their hour and a half, 2 hours of time. So I don't feel comfortable with a few people in here making a decision for
We miss your sermon so much.
Yeah.
Well,
We have to have
I think looking at what the time is and for Wednesday nights and how we do it, I think would be dependent upon what are the topics.
Sure.
How do we move them and arrange them so that people could be involved with those. So,
But we consider.
Whatever you train them, is how they're going
yes, that's what we were thinking. Not just one, but multiple ones. Similar, if you were around many years ago when we had the Springdale University thing on Sunday nights, where we'd come in and we'd have a Bible study in the sanctuary, and we had another study. I think Matt, you even taught the worldview one time, right? Yeah. So it's sort of similar to that, but you know, in concept, and this is in the infancy.
Yes.
You know, I asked Pastor if we could do it during this period of time for this, but we want to use this to help us grow. And how do we improve Wednesday night by having a menu of other options for people to choose from?
Right.
So, and it may be that we do prayer corporately and then break out, or we may have each one do their own prayer session. All of that is to be determined and figured out, but that's what our goal and plan is.
He talked about the election sermons, and there's a website called, it's either blackrobes.com or blackrobesregiment.com, and you can go to that website and read some of those old election sermons if anybody's interested.
Yeah. The Black Robe Brigade is what the British royalty called the pastors in America. They claimed even that the reason why America became independent is because of the Black Robe Brigade. So that's a comment that they made. I need to close this up. I do want to thank Mark for coming and doing this. He's been a great friend, and I just hope that we can all pray that God blesses him in his endeavors, because he's following God's heart to share this message with everyone. Let me close in prayer real quickly, and then we'll get you out. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time tonight. We thank you for the message that you've given us over the 5 weeks. We ask that you challenge each of our hearts to really truly understand, to make sure we understand that we're following your direction in our lives, and we've accepted your values and not our own personal values as the set of values to live by. And we ask you to guide and direct us. We love you for who you are, and we just want to serve you in every capacity. We ask all of this in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen.
Yeah. I'll take her.
Had a nice